Okay.
Angela.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and it's great to see so many of you online and joining us from all over the world. So, as Ariane just said, in today's webinar, I will introduce the London project, provide some background information, and will then focus on the conservation and analysis of the leather assemblage. This will then be followed by Quita, who is the leather specialist for this project, and her work focuses on the interpretation and detailed description of the assemblage. When I undertook this work, I was employed as a senior archaeological conservator with Historic England, and I've since changed roles, but I'm delighted to be here today and to talk to you about this project and the amazing leather finds. This project was funded by Historic England, my previous employer, and hence the many labels on all the slides. I do apologize for that. And his Cotswold Archaeology were acting as the project managers. The work was undertaken by Historic England specialists and by quite a few external contractors and specialists as well. Sorry, let me just... Right, there we go. And so I thought for a quick orientation, it might be quite useful to just start with the map. For those less familiar with where everything is based, the Historic England research facilities are situated on the south coast of England in Portsmouth, and it might also be worthwhile mentioning that Historic England is not a museum. So even though they work on assemblages of archaeologically recovered material, they don't hold on to any artifacts. Those assemblages are eventually given back to repositories or local museums relevant to the find spot. And in the case of the London wreck, this is Southend-on-Sea, which is close to the wreck site, and the local community has developed a huge interest in the London wreck, which is always great for us when we work with those local connections. So the London was built at Chatham Historic Dockyard, 1654 to 1656, during a time of great political upheaval. After the English Civil War and the First Anglo-Dutch War, the London played a significant role in British history. The ship formed part of the convoy sent in 1660 to collect Charles II from the Netherlands and restore him to the throne. In March 1665, the London sank following a gunpowder explosion on board as it was just being prepared and loaded for the Second Anglo-Dutch War. The wreck was discovered in the 1960s when a bronze cannon was lifted from the side, and this was followed by a magnetometer survey in the 1980s and an archaeological assessment in 2007, which then resulted in the designation of the wreck in 2008. The London is one of 57 wreck sites protected under the Protection of Wrecks Act of 1973, and thereby falls under the management responsibility of Historic England. Most protected wreck sites have a licensee, so that is effectively an affiliated volunteer who looks after the wreck on behalf of Historic England. And these volunteers are absolutely crucial to Historic England, and they undertake a great deal of work. Anyone can become a volunteer to look after such a protected wreck site, but it does help if they can dive. And in agreement with Historic England, the licensees carry out monitoring, maintenance, and on occasion artifact recovery. So the wreck of the London lies in the Thames estuary, very close to a busy shipping lane. It is marked with number 29 on the map here, and you've got the arrow to help you as well to find your way around. This location in the Thames estuary puts the wreck at risk, actually at high risk, which is indicated by shifting sediment levels, which exposes artifacts. And as a consequence, the site has been on the Heritage at Risk Register since 2009. And one way to combat the at-risk status to an archaeological site is to deepen our knowledge about it. And this was achieved by a program of surface recovery and limited excavations, which took place from 2014 to 2016. And the artifacts discussed here today were recovered during this time. So over 700 small finds were recovered from the London, and generally speaking, preservation on the wreck site is very good, and it is therefore not surprising that more than half of the recoveries were made of an organic material, and of those wood was the largest material class. And in the organic artifact class, leather was then the second largest group recovered. An archaeological excavation, and the London project, of course, is a multidisciplinary project and often involves a whole load of specialists. And because of the sensitive nature of waterlogged materials, it is important that there is conservation advice and input early on. During the process of conservation, artifacts are closely examined, and the conservators are often the first people to notice details such as tool marks or repairs. And of course, this information is really important also for other specialists to undertake their work within their remit. So everything that is noticed will be recorded and hopefully shared amongst the various different specialists for everyone to be able to, undertake their work and their research on the artifacts. When artifacts first arrive in the lab after an excavation, we start off with an assessment, and alongside the usual descriptions, photography, and categorizing artifacts by their materials and level of decay, X-radiography can allow a deeper insight. So these X-ray images will produce a record of the material as found, or help in the identification and subsequent conservation work. Of course, X-radiography is most commonly used for inorganic materials, but can also be useful on occasion for organic materials that contain metal components, or have metal attachments, or other construction features that are not immediately visible. On this overview slide here in the bottom left, you can see a stacked heel from one of the shoes, and what you see here as the bright spots, so the brighter areas here, are actually wooden pegs that have taken on iron corrosion products from nearby iron artifacts, and therefore have a higher mineral content, and therefore show up brighter on the X-ray. And wood, being a porous material, will easily absorb these corrosion products, and that's why we can see them on the X-rays. So materials recovered from the marine environment contain dissolved salts, and these can be harmful in the long run, as salts are hygroscopic and can lead to efflorescence or increased corrosion, and should therefore be removed. After recovery, artifacts are stored in fresh water, and then once in the lab, this is changed to distilled water. We check the progress of desalination by measuring the conductivity of the wash water, and when this has plateaued off over some time, desalination is considered complete, and next treatment steps can then be implemented. Outlined here at the top is outlined here is the typical process for organic materials that organic materials go through. But please remember, this is sort of the ideal and typical scenario. Often adjustments have to be made depending on the individual condition, and that is why, for example, chemical pre-treatment stage is presented here in brackets, as not every artifact needs that. And equally, I have presented freeze drying, so that is freeze drying without the vacuum, in a paler shade of blue, because it is not commonly undertaken, and although it's perfectly possible to very slowly dry some organic materials in a freezer without the application of a vacuum, but as I say, it's not commonly undertaken. And for some materials, such as wood, for example, it should not be recommended. So at the bottom, this is sort of the typical conservation flow line for leather artifacts. And if we just focus on that a bit more, so yeah, let's delve into that a bit more and look at some more aspects. So during the assessment stage, it is, you know, you handle the leather quite a lot, and you may even undertake some cleaning at the stage already to help you with your assessment and your descriptions. And for the London artifacts, this was generally undertaken by placing the leather on a wooden frame that was covered in a mesh, so that I could lay the artifacts out and have water running over it, and so that the dirt could go through the mesh, and I wouldn't lose any small fragments that would stay on top of the mesh, but I could sort of continuously work in a fairly cleanish setup that way. At this stage, I use tap water, soft brushes, sponges, or sometimes simply my hands. What I've got here as well is a close-up of an airbrush for certain aspects, a bit more stubborn dirt, that can be quite useful, and the airbrush is also just operated with tap water. So if during the cleaning stage, obviously this is again where you notice a lot of things, but also other attachments such as textiles, wooden pegs, or any decorations might come to light. And then this again is fed into the assessment to not only inform, you know, future conservation steps that you may take, but also to be shared with other specialists. And here for the London specifically, that would have been the leather, but also the textile specialist. Then I already mentioned desalination. We used distilled water for that, which was monitored by measuring the conductivity of the water, and you just carry out regular water changes, and when the conductivity plateaus off, we consider desalination complete. So impregnation was undertaken using a 30% PEG polyethylene glycol 400 solution. Impregnation was undertaken in a bath, so in little tubs with a close-fitting lid. And the image I've just popped up there are two pieces from a leather shoe after conservation, and all the sort of darkish staining you see around the leather on the acid-free tissue are remnants of the PEG. And with hindsight and on sort of reflection, I'm wondering whether 30% was actually quite high, because the leather was in a really good condition, and I think I could have possibly gotten away with something like 20%. So PEG is a hygroscopic material. It will continue interacting with the environment post-conservation, and this is not unusual to see sort of PEG residue migrating into the surrounding packaging and storage materials. So, but before we get to this dry stage after impregnation, we of course still have to do the vacuum freeze drying. And as I say, we undertook vacuum freeze drying, which is relatively fast and very gentle. If you have items that have a bit more of a shape to them, a 3D form, I used a material called X-Lite here to maintain that shape. You know, it's fully waterproof, water-resistant material. It can go into the PEG bath already, or you can also just apply it during the freeze-drying stage to maintain the shape of shoe uppers, for example, as illustrated here. The other point I wanted to make is that on leather we often have well-preserved thicker parts, and as well as less well-preserved thinner parts, as illustrated here by this book cover. The edges are much thinner and frayed compared to the internal areas, and the vacuum freeze drying process cannot differentiate between the thinner and the thicker parts on a piece of leather, and drying will happen equally throughout, and that of course means that the thinner parts on the edges will dry faster than the thicker or the sort of more well-preserved areas. So what I do in this case is after a bit of drying time, and when I think that the thinner edges are dry, I cover it up with the silicone release paper and then weigh that down with rice-filled bags inside the vacuum freeze dryer. And this means that the rate of drying is slowed down on the edges, and those edges are protected then, whilst the inner area here, the better preserved area, is still fully accessible and can continue drying in the vacuum freeze dryer. So I now want to move on to some textiles associated with the leather. The textile work was undertaken by the textile specialist Margarita Glaber, and what we see here is a close-up of a shoe upper, and the interesting part is the shoelace here. So I'm sure Quita may say a bit more about this in a bit, but it is a time where shoe fashion, or well, shoes were adorned with roses, so big colorful ribbons or bows on the shoes. And this photo doesn't actually show all the 4 perforations that we have in this upper here, in the tongue of the upper. But the important aspect to point out is that the shoelace, this bit of ribbon, is still attached from the tongue into the perforations of the latches, and we don't get these sort of tiny little aspects in archaeology a lot, where we have that contextual information still preserved and present. Then stitching survived in many of the leather shoes as well. And also there is bucket fragments that also still had stitching in the stitch holes. And this was done using a coarse, possibly S-plied thread, which in most cases survived as tufts of fibers in the holes only, so as illustrated here. The material used as the stitching medium for the leather shoes and the leather bucket consisted of coarsely processed plant bast fibers. So there were 3 shoes that still had their shoelaces attached to them, and all 3 shoelaces are made of silk. There were furthermore 2 textiles associated with shoes, so that were sort of well, slightly stuck or attached to the insoles, and those were made from, so those textiles on the insoles of the shoes were made from poorly processed plant fibers, possibly hemp, but further work would be required to really confirm this. Dye analysis was undertaken on the 3 shoelaces, and this detected tannins in all 3 cases, and in one case, additionally to the tannin, also indigotin was detected. Okay, I'm now moving on to one of the book covers. So when this was cleaned, I noticed slightly different colored patches on one of the edges here, and you see the images on the left are when the leather book cover was still wet and unconserved. And I've tried to enlarge the image here. So this is basically what it looks like after conservation, but this is during or before conservation. And these little patches were investigated using a non-destructive method of chemical analysis called XRF, or X-ray fluorescence. And what we suspected to be gilding can be seen on the edges here. And amazingly though, also the underside, so that is the inside of the book cover, showed some red staining. And this is what I'm holding open here, and it's extremely difficult to see when the leather is wet, and especially in a photograph. So those areas here are the turn-ins. So those are little flaps that fold over the boards and hold the boards in place. Here you see a screenshot of the XRF analysis that was undertaken by the material scientist. And this confirmed that the areas of gold, what we suspected to be gold was indeed gold, and that the paint or the red on the inside also survived, and it showed that this book cover was quite an elaborate and possibly costly item. The red paint on the inside was the mercury-based pigment vermilion, and vermilion was quite expensive, so it was often mixed with the cheaper materials, and in this case it had been mixed with red lead oxide. Amazingly though, also some remains of the bookboard survived. At this time, the bookboards were not made of wood, but of cardboard, and the fibers of which were extremely poorly preserved, but could be distinguished again as a bast fiber. So what this demonstrates is that despite the wreck site being at risk, the level of preservation for materials such as pigments and what is effectively paper or cardboard are extremely good on this wreck site. Okay, the last aspect I want to briefly mention is species identification, and this was undertaken by, or this, generally speaking, this can be undertaken by examination of the grain follicle pattern, and Quita quite often does this as part of her work anyway, and you normally use magnification for that. But another method that has gained traction lately is ZOOMS, which stands for Zooarchaeology by Mass Spectrometry, and this is used for species identification of archaeological faunal materials, mainly mainly bone, but can also be used for skin, leather, and parchment. It is also sometimes called peptide fingerprinting. It is a destructive method, but on this slide here, you need only a very small amount of sample. And the samples are then identified by differences in the mass of the peptides, which arise as a result of sequence differences between the species. And apart from identifying the animals some of the leather was made from, we also had some very specific questions, which I listed on the left-hand side of the slide here, with regards to the marine burial environment. The two items from the London wreck that we analyzed were a book cover and a shoe. The leather was initially thought to be calf or sheep, and in the case of the shoe, zooms resulted in an identification of Bos taurus. And when the leather specialist looked at this again, then, sorry, I should just say, when Quita looked at this again, then it could be further narrowed down as calf. The book cover had the least well-preserved peptides, and Zoom's ID was less precise. So the better preserved the peptides, the more accurate Zoom's ID becomes, and vice versa. So Quita first identified the leather for the book cover as calf, but when we then communicated the Zoom's results, which gives a much a broader possibility of possible animals that could have been used for this book cover. Quita, in her interpretation, also included deer, because sometimes book covers are made from deer or fawn skin. So, but please bear in mind, it could still be calf because of the poor sort of peptide preservation in this case. But this is a really nice example of how morphological and analytical methods can sort of inform and complement each other. So I'm sort of coming to the end now and wrapping up. Just to let you know, artifacts from the London have already featured in 3 temporary exhibitions, and about 6 artifacts are on permanent display at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. And of course, there currently, again, is the display of London artifacts in Southend-on-Sea in the temporary exhibition called The London Shipwreck, Her Final Voyage. And this exhibition is on until May 2026. And yeah, if you're nearby, go and have a look at that. And then I just wanted to point out, well, first of all, let me say, I said earlier already, a project like the London is obviously a huge team effort. But I wanted to just highlight one person, James Davies, who undertook, who took all the amazing professional photographs. And if you, yeah, looked at the slides just now, you can see the real difference between his and my photography skills. And we're going to see a few more of them in Quita's presentation in a minute, and many of those images will also feature in the upcoming monograph, and I put the working title up on this last slide here. So I'm sure once this is out, we will put a little notification in the archaeological newsletter to let the membership know. And with that, I finish my presentation, and I stop sharing. Oh God, and oh, hang on, where am I? Sorry, I have multiple screens on the go here, but hand over to Quita.
Wonderful, thank you, Angela. That's great. Quita, if you would like to share your screen.
That's it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, here in England, the year 1665 didn't start very well, and then it went rapidly downhill after that. At the beginning of March, the Second Anglo-Dutch War broke out, and an early casualty of this, as you know now, was the London, who managed to accidentally blow herself up when sailing from Chatham Dockyard to take up position in the Thames estuary. Depending on which diary account you go with, of the more than 300 folk aboard at the time, sadly, only 24 survived. As you know, the London sank in the Thames estuary and is next to a very busy shipping lane. The visibility is low and I'm told that the diving conditions are very difficult. Now, I've never been diving myself, but from what I can see from the videos, they seem to grope around in soft brown sludge, and somehow they find soft brown coloured leather. I don't know how they manage it, but manage it they do, and I often take a look at it. It's not moving, I'm afraid.
You might just have to click on the slide again and then use the cursor down to forward to the next slide.
Right.
Yeah, just go next at the top.
I haven't got next at the top.
Oh, I just saw that.
Oh,
there you go.
Never mind. Here we go. Now here, this is better. Here's some pictures of the stuff from the London. And it includes shoes, book covers, bits of buckets and bandoliers. I must confess the bucket that you're looking at now isn't from the London, but all the rest of the things are. This bucket is a nice complete one. It's of later date, I'm afraid. I just put it here to remind us all what a decent complete bucket looks like. This is what our buckets actually look like from the London. Most of the images you're going to see is of conserved leather that Angela's worked her magic on already. And I'm going to show you some lovely reconstructed drawings by our own ALG's very own Marquita Vulcan. And they're really going to help make the leather come to life, I hope. Now, I've seen several groups of 17th century shoes before. So when I started, I was happy that I knew roughly what to expect from the shoes, but I didn't know anything about book covers or about bandoliers. In the event, even the shoes managed to throw up a few surprises for me. But as it turned out, in many ways, the real stars of the show were the bandoliers. Oh, here we go. Now, for those of you who don't know much about 17th century military equipment, and I include myself in that, a bandolier is the name given to the leather belt worn across the shoulder that held all the bits and pieces that you needed to fire the musket. So dangling off this belt was a series of small containers holding individual charges of gunpowder, a powder flask, and a pouch to hold the musket shot. On the left, you can see a chap wearing his bandolier with all these bits dangling off, his gunpowder containers and what have you. And on the right is a carved wooden bandolier, and it's part of a really beautifully carved picture frame that Angela found on one of her museum visits. The London bandoliers were recovered from a broken wooden chest found on the gun deck next to a gun station. The divers brought up bits of belts and shot pouches and also some wooden powder containers. They think that the wooden chest had contained at least 2 layers of belts, with a layer of wooden powder containers laying in between. No, oops. At last, this is one of the belts that was complete. This is a photograph taken by Dan Pascoe very soon after it was brought up onto the recovery boat. And it shows the complete one that we have with some of the wooden powder containers. When it was wet, it was measured about 1.3 meters in length, and that's about 4.5 feet in old money. Several other bits of these belts, as you can see, were nearly complete, and there were lots and lots of small pieces from many more. Now, should you run across one of these bits of belt yourself, the defining thing that you'll see is that they have their holes are paired, and that's so that they could hang the suspension strings through the pairs of holes. And that's the defining thing of them if you just happen to find a small piece, because if not, they would look very much as like an ordinary belt. I spent quite a lot of time trying to match up these little individual pieces, trying to work out how many bandoliers were represented by the bits that have been recovered. But I needn't have worried, as it happens, because I found out later that they left loads more bits of the belts actually down there on the wreck. And in fact, there's another box apparently still down there. They don't look like much now, of course, just a bunch of straps, but really, actually, these things are quite a rarity. Only small bits of belts have been found archaeologically, at least from this country. Much of what is known about bandoliers comes from curated examples in museums and private collections, and these are often of uncertain date and provenance. Some of the bandoliers from the London have survived really well, and of course they're closely dated, so they are of some interest. The London bandolier belts were made from a single piece of cattle hide, and they have two tapering ends that were joined together with a butt seam that lay flat. The sides aren't stitched and they hadn't been lined. Most of them actually were very well made, but it's clear that a few had been made by adapting an old strap. Two pieces of belt have stamps on the flesh side, which you can see on the left-hand side of the screen here. Both stamps have a serif letter P or possibly a D, followed by another letter or numeral. They're deep, they've been well cut, and we think using a heavy punch, so they're not likely to be secondary owner's marks, but more likely to be official stamps denoting that these two was probably standard issue. As far as I know at the moment, these are the only stamps to be found on a bandolier. These are shoulder pads. A semicircular shoulder pad was sewn onto one edge of the belt at the opposite end of the join, and the pad helped to distribute the weight of all those bits that were dangling off the belt, and perhaps to some extent protect against recoil when the musket was fired. The quality of the leather varied quite widely, as you can see. Shown on the right of the screen is the distinctive stitching that was used to attach the shoulder pad to the strap, and they also use this stitching to join the two ends of the strap together. Sorry, I'm having trouble. There we are. We found three shot pouches from the wreck, and this shows two of them. They're made of two panels of soft leather. The back panel is teardrop shaped and the front panel is more semicircular. The mouth is closed with a drawstring. The best preserved one is shown at the bottom of the screen and in the reconstruction, Marquita's lovely reconstruction on the right. This has a lobed strap stitched to the top of the pouch. The strap was folded over and it's too narrow to be actually threaded onto the belt itself, so it must have been hung from a belt by a separate cord. Other shot pouches in museum collections and those in contemporary illustrations have a front flap covering the mouth, but the London one showed no evidence for a front flap. The thin leather of the London pouches was heavily worn and it was difficult to identify from the grain pattern alone. But luckily there were some hairs still present in each of them, and Esther Cameron was able to confirm and identify them as sheepskin from those hairs. I went to visit the Royal Armouries in Leeds to take a look at what they had in their collections, and their bandoliers, the 17th century ones at least, were rather different from the London ones. The belts were wide and had stitching for a lining. The ends of the belts overlapped and theirs were joined with metal rivets, rather than the butt seams that we have on the London examples. We think that the metal rivets may possibly be later repairs. Their shoulder pads were very angular, and ours, as you know, are semicircular. The shot pouches were smaller and very different. Unlike our soft pouches, their pouches had a rigid six-sided back panel of thick leather onto which a semicircular front panel of soft leather was stitched. from the London, so we now know for certain what one style of mid-17th century bandolier and shot pouch looked like, but no doubt other styles of bandolier and pouch were available. Now to the shoes. 6 shoes were complete or nearly complete, but I was mainly faced with a large number of separate bits of shoe. As you can imagine, as the stitch rots and the shoes break up, the parts get separated, and it's always difficult to say just how many shoes may have come from the bits that you're left with. But my best guess here is between 30 and 35 shoes. The shoes are all of welted constructions, have square toes, vamped with long tongues, and fastened with latchets on the quarters. The shoes fall fairly neatly into 2 groups. The first group is made up of shoes found scattered around the wreck. The second is a larger group of shoes found tightly stacked together on the gun deck. We're going to deal with the complete shoes first. These shoes, as I say, were found individually scattered around the wreck. Being found separately, one imagines that these shoes were being worn by the people on board when the ship went down. They each tied across the instep with the laces threaded through tongs and latchets. Out of the shoes found separately, this is the only one example which was flat and didn't have a heel. Here are the bits, and next, here we are, they're miraculously put back together again. The other shoes were more fashionable and all had stacked leather heels. This one has a wide forked toe. Another one had a mushroom-shaped tongue and its edges decorated with impressed lines. Now these 3 shoes have an additional pair of holes in the vamp tongue to hold the decorative feature that Angela told you about, made of silk or lace and called a rose. The remains of silk ribbon ties have survived in the lower hole on the pairs of 2 of our shoes and in the upper pair of holes on another one. These silk laces are now, of course, archaeological brown in colour, but they may have been brightly coloured originally, or they may have been black, as shown here in the contemporary portrait. Now for the second group of shoes. These were all found packed closely together on the gun deck, and in contrast to the shoes that you've just looked at, these shoes were clearly not being worn when the vessel sank, but had been stored together. These shoes were mostly found as individual shoe parts, and here's some during conservation. But a few had some of their component parts still attached, like these 2 examples. The drawing at the top on the left is of one shoe, and you're looking down on it from the inside. The one on the left from the inside, and the one on the right, you're looking at it from the outside. You can still see the insole because the sole hasn't actually survived, so you're looking at the other side of it. We've got the reconstruction of it at the bottom. And the shoe in the photograph on the right of your screen is from a different shoe, and this one has part of its vamp surviving in place. In all, I think we're probably looking at 12 pairs of shoes of this. They're all of the same general style. The shoes had deteriorated quite badly, and often the leather had delaminated, but judging from the soles, the shoes appear to be hardly worn and may even have been new. These shoes were flat and didn't have separate heels, but again they have square toes and the tongues are slightly pointed. They fasten across the instep with latchets, but these latchets don't have a lace hole in the end, and so they didn't actually tie across the instep. Instead, they would have fastened with buckles, but no buckles were found with them. The latchets themselves are often shorter and some were made separately and been sewn onto the quarters. They weren't integral with the quarters. This would allow smaller pieces of leather to be used and so presumably be slightly cheaper to make. Though all these shoes are of the same general style, they would look slightly different. Some were grain outside and would have appeared smooth and shiny, but others were flesh side outward and would have looked like suede. In the photograph on the right, you can see that the grain side of the leather was on the inside of the shoe, so this one would have had a suede appearance. These shoes are show slight variations in construction, so although they looked very similar, they were not exactly the same. Altogether, the shoes look less high fashion and less expensive than the heeled ones, but this fact is completely contradicted in some of the aspects of the shoes, because some of the shoes have decorated soles. The decoration takes the form of impressed lines. Some are straight and some are curved. While some are not so much more as marking out lines, others do go beyond simple marking out lines, as you can see, and into the realms of actual decoration. Now you must bear with me here, because in the photographs I know that they look more like insoles, but believe me, they are actually shoe soles. The row of grain flesh stitching is inset some distance from the actual edge of the sole, as you can see, and in most of the examples this edge has been completely broken away along this line of stitching, and that's gone. And this you can see on the two soles shown on the left of the screen. What's actually happened is best seen in the broken sole you can see in the middle of your screen here. This sole is found in two pieces, but those two pieces fit together as shown by the wonders of technology on the very right of your screen, and also in the line drawing in the middle. You can see in the upper photo that the outer edge of the tread area of the sole has broken away along the line of stitching. But convenient for me, it still survives on the bottom piece of the sole that fits to the top, and it shows exactly what was going on. And these are a few more examples to show you. Again, most of the seam is broken off, but the photo in the bottom left here is another sole with part of its seam and the outer edge still intact. It also has a bit of welt just above, as you can see. Now this sole is a similar design to the broken one that I showed you earlier and that you can see in the drawing here, but it does differ slightly. Now these sole decorations are another rarity. John Nichols tells me of a decorated shoe soles that he's seen on 17th century burial shoes in the Archer family vault at a church in Kilkenny, and he also knows of another example on a child's shoe from Dublin. And now I know there are a handful of 17th century examples in some Swedish shoe collections, including a pair known to have been worn by a chap on his wedding day. But apart from that, they really are very, very uncommon. All in all, these flat shoes found stored together have presented me with a bit of a problem, because they seem to be practical footwear with elements of high fashion, which is the combination that I've come across before. And added to the strangeness of finding that some of the shoes had decorated shoe soles is the fact that they didn't actually tie with laces but fastened with buckles. Now, buckled shoes were a pretty recent introduction in 1665 when the London went down, and so at that time they must have been highly fashionable. Style-conscious Samuel Pepys records first wearing buckles on his shoes in January of 1660. John Evelyn records that the king wore shoe buckles for the first time in 1666, but he did imply that in the circles that the king must have mixed in, he was a bit late to take up the fashion. That being said, buckled shoes were not commonly worn by ordinary folk for quite a long time. The sinking of the London in 1665 falls squarely into the period of transition of men's shoe fastenings, but even so, were buckles on your shoes a fashion statement liked made by an ordinary sailor? If not intended for the ordinary sailor, but a more wealthy wearer, then why were these shoes flat and not made with fashionable heels? If intended for the crew, then why not fasten them with a more practical lace? It's much safer not to have metal buckles when you've got gunpowder on board. And where are the buckles? These shoes can't be worn as they are without buckles. These shoes were unwearable as they are and probably new. Clearly, the buckles were meant to be put on later. Surely there would not be time to fiddle about putting on detachable buckles when the action stations were called on board. These shoes were not intended to be worn on the ship. So had an enterprising sailor bought a job lot of shoes before sailing, planning to sell them when he got back to port? Your guess is as good as mine. Thank you.
Thank you, Quita.
There we
That
are.
was wonderful. Very interesting insights into what we can discover from finds like that. Both presentations are wonderful. Thank you. Now I'm going to stop recording. Am I?